Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and we are on the fourth book of the Susan Coolidge, Katie series. There is a fifth book, which, as you can see in this cover, is not part of the four books in this. But we'll get to that when we get to that. So, we are now on Clover. At this point, the Katie series, after the usual introductory chapters that sort of talk about other things before the main story starts, at that point this book takes a turn and we basically leave Katie's story behind and she becomes a tertiary character. So here we are, Clover. This is actually not a spoiler per se for things that are happening in the story. I mean, at some point Clover goes to Colorado, but Clover goes to Colorado doesn't really tell a story. That just is like a vague description. So let's move on to the spoilerific discussion. So at the start of the book, this is, by the way, the back cover of the dust jacket, which I put in because this is the illustration that is in those early chapters, but colored. So I figured here, have the color illustration. So at the start of Clover, we're still in Katie's story that left off in the last book, and that is that Katie is going to marry Lieutenant Ned Worthington of the American Navy. And so this particular scene is, as shown here, is Katie and Clover. Clover has insisted that Katie sort of waltz with her in the living room because they have just gotten a whole bunch of letters, and one of those letters has said that Rose Red will be coming for the wedding and bringing her daughter Little Rosaline, because that's exactly the kind of person Rose is, that she would name her daughter Rosaline. And that they would be coming to Katie's wedding. Katie's wedding is interesting in that Katie is very, very determined, as she puts it, for the wedding to just happen. The way she does this is she decides to not get married in a church, to get married at home. She decides to keep the wedding very, very small, and she decides to make the wedding into effectively like just a thing where several people come over and we have a party, and at one point 2 people get married. And so everybody kind of expresses some doubt, but Katie is determined to not have bridesmaids and a maid of honor and groomsmen and a best man and a wedding that requires an advance rehearsal. She basically says, I'm going to walk down the stairs in my wedding dress, and Ned will be waiting at the bottom of the stairs, and the clergyman will be standing next to Ned, and he will say, do you, and we'll both say yes, and then it will be over. And that's basically how the wedding happens. That everybody arrives, bit by bit over the couple of days leading up to the wedding, and by everybody, I mean Ned Worthington, his superior officer, Rose Red and her daughter, and Cousin Helen, and that's basically everybody. I mean, there is, of course, the Carrs and Ned's sister, Mrs. Ashe, Polly Ashe, who is the woman who took Katie to Europe in the previous book. But it's basically just really, really immediate family and some really immediate friends, and that's it. And I will say that there are very great advantages to insisting on your wedding being that small, not the least of which being that it requires minimal planning, it requires minimal outlay of expenses, and when you insist that everything be that small, it saves you also on a lot of hurt feelings, because if what you're saying is, I want one person who is my best friend and my siblings and parents, and that's all I want there, you're going to have a small wedding and people can't start complaining that you left anybody out, because what you're saying is, I wanted a maximum of 15 people. We have 15 people. That's the whole wedding. We are done. So Katie gets married to Ned, and then following that spends several months living at home with her family because I'm skipping ahead. We'll get to this picture in a moment. Because Ned is in the military and they haven't actually set up a home for her to stay in, and he, being in the Navy, leads a peripatetic lifestyle anyways, so Katie stays at home. And then the youngest brother, Phil, gets sick. And he's very seriously ill. And even after he recovers, he's still, sort of an invalid. That it's just, physical weakness, easy exhaustion, susceptibility to getting sick again, etc., etc. And it's decided that, in the medical wisdom of the time, that the best thing to do would be to send him to a better climate. Which is a thing, after all, people have done for a donkey's age, which is to say, you should go to a better climate. This climate, with its drier air or higher altitude or whatever the prevailing wisdom is, will be better. I don't know how much of that is actually valid science, but it's a thing that people have done for a very long time, and it's not merely a let's send them somewhere where you have nursing care. It's a, we believe that the atmosphere will be better. So, Dr. Carr gets a recommendation. Well, he gets several recommendations, but the one that appeals to him the most is Colorado, where a doctor friend of his lives. And Clover and Phil get sent off to Colorado. And there's an initial section where they travel with some friends of Mrs. Ashe, because Mrs. Ashe and Katie are going to be meeting up with Ned, and so everybody can all travel together at least part of the way down. And we also have Mrs., I believe Wilson is her name, who lines up. You see her here. There's Clover in the front, Phil right behind, and Mrs. Wilson in the back, off to the far right. And Dr. Carr is concerned because Clover is very young, and Phil is an invalid teenage boy is a heavy responsibility, especially when you're not actually his parents. But Dr. Carr can't leave his medical practice behind, and, Katie basically just got married, and she should be spending time with her husband, and that leaves Clover, who is over the age of 20. So she is an adult. But everybody else is younger than that, and so there's nobody else that Dr. Carr can send. But he's nervous, and so after some discussion with friends and friends of friends, they hear that there is an older woman named Mrs. Watson who will be heading out to Colorado at the same time, and she can sort of act as a guardian and helpmeet and what have you for Clover, and then they find out that this woman was actually looking for someone to take care of her and is nothing more than an abstraction, a distraction, and a drag on Clover's resources. And one of Katie's big pieces of advice to Clover is, look, what you're here to do is take care of Phil. So you take care of Phil. If you can do something for Mrs. Watson, that's fine, but do not let her eat up your time. You're not here for her, and she is a grown woman. Just don't. And so Clover manages to balance these things, but in this moment, never in her life had Clover felt so small and incompetent and so very, very young, is that moment when Katie and Mrs. Ashe and the friends who had helped them get to Colorado have gone. And Clover is now on her own in a train station in an unfamiliar part of the United States, which, if you don't know, which I hope you do, is, after all, a very large country, and there are large portions of it which will be very unfamiliar to everybody at some point, because you can't visit everywhere in the U.S. It's a lifetime job on its own if that's a thing you want to do. There's too much of it. Anyways, so Clover gets left at this train station and has to make her way through things. We have here "Good Night, You Beautiful Thing," which it comes up later in the book when Clover discovers that cousin Clarence, who she made friends with in what Katie did at school, has moved out to Colorado and is now effectively a cowboy. And she and Phil wind up spending a week sort of semi-vacationing up in the hut where Clarence and his partner Jeff Templestowe live. And so this is Clover's first night there. And by the end of the book, Clover has found the man she wants to marry, which is Jeff Templestowe. There is a bit of an issue because there are in fact 3 young men who all want to ask Clover to marry them. But in the end, she chooses Jeff, and the end of this book is delightful. Among other things, earlier on in the book, Clover had expressed the somewhat both understandable and yet amusingly lacking in understanding sentiment that how much she loved Navy husbands because they can get married and then they'll leave their wives and go away for a good long time, because of course she doesn't really want things to change, and so she wants Katie to stay at home with the family, and so if Katie is married to Ned, then she can stay at home with the family, and then sometimes she goes off with Ned, but then she'll be back again, and everything is great. And Rose had basically said, "Oh, Clover, you have no idea. I don't want to abandon my husband, and neither does Katie. That's why we married them." And at the end of the book, Rose writes Clover a very remonstrating letter that, unlike Deniston or Ned, Deniston being Rose's husband, Jeff will actually be at home with Clover all the time, and that, really, Clover, you're the one who's moving away to a completely different state from, everybody, and with a guy who will never ever be going anywhere. What about all that stuff that you said? And Clover's response is the one line, "Guilty but recommended to mercy." This book continues, of course, the theme of having a few genuine characters. Among other things, Mrs. Wilson is very, very much a character. She is this beautifully designed person who absolutely does not fit on the semi-frontier lifestyle. The idea is that what you have is this town that has sprung up over literally only 20 years, but because they're on a train line, everybody is able to get everything they need there, and the town has built up very, very rapidly. And so everyone who gets there thinks that there's going to be, a complete lack of civilization. Oh, we're not going to be able to get those arrowroot biscuits that we want, and we're not going to be able to have enough of this and that. And they get there and they find a perfectly normally functioning town with all of the amenities that you would expect. And so we did have this packing moment early in the book where Clover and the others are busy trying to put all the things into the bags that she'll need, and then she gets there and discovers there was no need to pack any of this. Anyway, this is delightful because, of course, we get a view into Clover's life, and we get this book that really genuinely focuses on Clover, who, after all, isn't Katie, and has her own things. She doesn't have flaws. She is as unflawed as Katie, but in a slightly different way. And so this is very, very enjoyable, and I think that's everything that I'm going to say. So I will see you all next week.